Good evening, welcome to another Focus on Friday, and today we're going to discuss Edward Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter was born in the Victorian era, specifically in August of 1844, and he was an English utopian socialist, poet, philosopher, anthropologist, early advocate for gay rights, prison reform, and a staunch vegetarian, of all things, which in that time was something that was completely unheard of. As a philosopher, he was particularly known for a bunch of different publications and his connections, and we'll get into that in a little while. He was born in Brunswick Square in Sussex. His father was a carpenter and also a governor. He had some brothers. He had a vice admiral grandfather in the British Navy. And he did end up going to Cambridge to study. He didn't particularly care for it, though. He was bored very easily while he was there. But he did imprint on himself what would end up being his direction in life. He fell under the influence of Christian socialist and theologian F.D. Maurice, and he began to explore his social skills and things of that nature, and he began to explore his sexual nature as well. Excuse me. After the university, he was ordained as a curate in the Church of England, but not out of belief. It was out of a convention. He saw it as a means to an end. In 1871, Carpenter was invited to become a tutor in the royal palace, but he turned that down. He just didn't think that was something that was suited for his personality type. And in the following years, he experienced an increasing sense of dissatisfaction with his life in the church and the university, and became completely disillusioned in Victorian society in general. He thought it was very overdone. Excuse me. And a whole lot of pomp and self-absorption that society was leading itself into corruption. So he decided to move voluntarily to the north of England and became part of the university extension movement, where he started to bring education to the lower classes. He was a staunch believer that the elitism of the Victorian era was contradictory to how society should function, and that the distinction between the higher classes and the lower classes was a fallacy, and he lived that. So he spent a lot of time with the lower classes running education programs and such. When his father, Charles Carpenter, died, he was inherited a pretty good sum, enough that he could quit all of his jobs and just start doing pretty much what he wanted to when he wanted to. And that was when he began exploring his relationships, multiple, with other men in a very rural and industrial setting. He had a series of partners that were all of the lower social classes. They were carpenters, they were iron builders, they were farmers, gardeners, things of that nature. But he still socialized quite a bit with the upper classes. And he became a prolific writer at this time, and he started to specifically advocate against the established industrialization. He longed for what was called a simpler life. He believed that we should reconnect with nature and with each other as a social construct rather than as a capitalist construct. And in that way, he was an early socialist that was very influential. In fact, he first published his, we'll say, long poem, Towards Democracy, in 1883, where he justified that democracy was something that could only be attained by giving up material wealth. And he was influenced specifically by Whitman's poetry in that regard. In the following years, he had a series of dissatisfied relationships and took a trip to India. And there he fell in love with Buddhist philosophy, and that started to move into his notions of cultural structure and how people should interact with the world around them. In 1891, he actually would find and settle down with George Merrill, who ended up being his life partner from that time until his death, who was a metalworker. And they at first lived in a nice country chateau and were very sensible and peaceable, although they did move back into the city, especially as his works about sexuality and socialism became more popular. He would, in fact, go on to become friends with scholars such as the Humanitarian League, Henry S. Salt, and Havelock Ellis, M. Foster, others such as, Keith Hardy, Mahatma Gandhi, Roger Fry, Havelock Ellis, Annette Bennett, John Ruskin, Olive Schreiner, Walt Whitman. They all were friends and routine pen pals of his. Unfortunately, he did die in 1928 very suddenly. No, my apologies. His partner died in 1928 very suddenly of alcoholism, and he followed not that long after in May, when he suffered from a stroke and passed away. So where does that leave us with Mr. Carpenter? He was ahead of his time and one of the social movers in both modern socialism, the gay rights movement in general, and humanitarianism, veganism, vegetarianism, and all of these movements that would come into the 20th century and be codified as humanitarian movements. And that is another one of us. So y'all have a good night.